Welcome to What Matters Now, the Times of Israel's weekly podcast. I'm Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our senior analyst Haviv Rettig Gur in an informal conversation. Hi, Haviv. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Amanda.
It's so nice to see you, and I know you need to dash off pretty soon to a speaking engagement, but I hope you're not going to be delayed because right now, as we're speaking, hundreds, if not thousands of Israelis are marching in support of the hostages in Gaza and their families from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So they're pretty much blocking part of the main arteries in this big, massive, or hopefully massive, at least from their perspective, march to raise awareness of the hostages' plight. So that got me kind of thinking, actually, Haviv, what gets people into the streets in Israel, even historically, and how effective have these protests been over time? So let's go into our time machine, okay? And let's look at the aftermath, actually, of another war, of the 1973 war, and talk to us a little bit about how protests actually did indeed shift the government.
Yeah, protests are a grand old tradition of Israeli society, of Israeli democracy on left and right. And they've really been a big feature of Israeli public life basically since 1973, since the 1973 war. There's some connection, and it's complicated, and it's a little subtle, and so I can't prove it. But it's generally, I think, believed that there's some connection between the 67 war, the Six-Day War, the war where we discovered that we were powerful, because the day before the war we were digging mass graves in Tel Aviv and not sure we were going to survive. And then we come out of that 67 war really feeling strong and a regional power and also, therefore, safe. And 6 years later, there's this 1973 war where the enemies, Syria and Egypt, surprised us and overwhelmed the forces on the borders. And it started to drive a kind of awakening among Israelis from a very early sense of loyalty to the state, because there's this dire dread of real, danger and existential threat. And as soon as Israelis are a little safer, they become a lot more critical. And so 1973 was this experience of the failure of military intelligence. People compared it constantly to October 7th to 1973, which was also, of course, in the same days, 50 years earlier, exactly. And after 73, after the war is won, and won in some statistical numerical ways, more spectacularly than 67. In other words, in terms of death toll, in terms of the damage inflicted on enemy industrial base, on the enemy military, it was a successful war. But the first day of it felt existential and like a tremendous failure. In the aftermath of the war, there is a lot of public anger, and the government establishes the Agranat Commission. Supreme Court Justice Agranat leads the commission to investigate the war. And their conclusions are a little bit complex. They recommended that the chief of staff resign. They actually said that Golda Meir, the prime minister, had handled herself fairly well. There's no serious critique of her in the commission report. But even though the report focused blame in certain places and not in others, really focused, I think, on the military. In other words, the head of Amman, Eli Zera, and David Elazar, the chief of staff, took most of the blame. The public response was bitter anger, both toward Defense Minister Moshe Dayan and toward Golda Meir. And a commander in the war on the Egyptian front, Moti Ashkenazi, who headed the Budapest outpost, the fort on the Bar-Lev line in the Sinai, the only major Israeli military position at the front line on the Egyptian front that wasn't overwhelmed and captured in that first day. He starts marching, and thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Israelis march with him. And there becomes this huge upswelling of anger and frustration. And, over the next 6 months, Golda Meir wins, it's important to say, wins the December 1973 election. But her party, what is today called the Labour Party, then was called the Ma'arach, or the Alignment, loses 5 seats. And over the course of that period of those months, Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, offers to resign twice. Golda Meir says no. He offers essentially to take the fall. And then April 1974, Golda Meir herself resigns because of that public criticism. And a man who is a former chief of staff, the great victor of the 67 war, Yitzhak Rabin, who had been sitting outside politics, comes in and forms a government in 74 and becomes prime minister for the next 3 years. This is a protest that, even though the prime minister was seen as was the best commission we could put together, sitting as carefully as it can, and there's a lot of respect historically for the Agranat Commission, said Golda Meir was okay. It wasn't her fault. And yet, nevertheless, the buck stops with her and she resigns. So that's a protest that brought down a government. When Begin goes into Lebanon in 82 and Ariel Sharon, the defense minister, gives orders, apparently without Begin's approval, to drive far past the southern Lebanese goals of the operation and actually get to Beirut, protests begin in Tel Aviv by Peace Now and by other left-wing organizations. And that sort of experience of 73, of a kind of awakening to the idea that our elites are not all-knowing and all capable, and actually capable of tremendous folly, really becomes ingrained in Lebanon. In the first Lebanon War, which a huge number of Israelis, including on the right, come to conclude was a mistake, at least how it was handled. And so we have this protest tradition ever since, and you see it come back constantly. The right had mass protests against the Oslo agreements in central Jerusalem and elsewhere. The left had mass protests in favor of the Oslo agreements in the 90s. There are protests that are not screaming that you want something to change, but in fact, mourning. For example, after the Rabin assassination in 95, tens of thousands of teenagers take to the streets, take to the squares, and light candles in his memory. That's a kind of protest. It's a kind of showing up and showing that this matters to you, and showing that you have your political agenda now has its martyr, and really coalescing and rallying around it. Protests in Israel, we talk about the very dramatic and painful things that drive them, but often protests themselves are incredibly fun, festive, clever, socializing experiences. For example, the right-wing protests against the disengagement in 2005, famously in the religious Zionist community, a huge number of marriages came out of those protests because it was the only place where large numbers of boys and girls from that community could interact repeatedly and pretty much unsupervised. And so protests are also this socializing kind of experience, and they're fundamental to how Israelis live and think about their politics.
A couple of comments on what you said. The first protest we talked about was in 1973, which is, of course, during the Vietnam War. And the idea of protests, I think, were so prevalent in Western society by that point that it was not such a leap for Israelis to take to the streets. This, of course, doesn't mean that Israelis didn't protest before 1973. But then when you fast forward into the first Lebanon War, which is arguably Israel's Vietnam War, at least the first one, we have a different kind of protest movement. It's definitely not a hippie type movement. It's deadly serious. Though when you're talking about the disengagement, of course, there were obviously many, many tears shed and much anger and just really a heart-rending thing to watch in 2005. But you mentioned this ability to rise above and to connect between different people. So really super interesting. One of the protests that I found also interesting was in 2011. And do you remember these protests? The cottage cheese protests.
The cost of living protests. Yeah.
Exactly. Tents along Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv, which is a little ironic in a way because Tel Aviv, at least that area, is pretty well heeled, shall we say. But perhaps that was the point of putting the tents up there. But do you remember how they panned out, Haviv?
Well, like, the Agranat Commission in 1973, the government's response was to set up the Trachtenberg Commission, which would Manuel Trachtenberg is an important economist. He was also a member of Knesset, and he was supposed to figure out all kinds of ways to lower the cost of living, and that commission didn't really go anywhere. And some of the most basic, simple, low-hanging fruit recommendations have still, 13 years later, not been implemented by the government. Some of them actually were supposed to be moved forward in the last 2 weeks, and the Knesset has failed to move them forward. So you I would say this. You bring up something that is actually really fascinating because I think there's a change in tone and tenor to protests in Israel in the last 5 years. Protests used to be about a policy, about a direction, about a desired outcome. Today, protests have become a kind of protest against the incapacity to have desired outcomes and directions and policies. And you see that in the hostage family protests. But the argument isn't the government isn't doing the right thing. The argument is the government refuses to even do anything. It refuses to win the war, and it refuses to end the war. It just lives in this kind of muddy middle ground in which everybody suffers because of the incapacity and maybe a little bit narcissism of the political class. And that sort of rebellion against a sense of a really collapsed and dilapidated political class, you see profoundly on the left, you see it on the right, you see it, when the right launched its judicial reform, the center left of the country, the single characteristic that most correlates to whether you supported or opposed judicial reform is your religious affiliation, your religious observance. So it was essentially a more traditional religious Israel against secular Israel. I mean, that's obviously a cartoon, but at 70 or 80% correlation, something at those scales, it's a very, very good simplifying way to think about it. And one felt, under assault by the other. It's not just that this, the last 5 years of protests since 2019, since that election ended without a decision, and then we went into this 5-election cycle, and then judicial reform, and then October 7. The anti-government protests haven't just been anti-Bibi, which is how Bibi's supporters have framed it. They're about a larger sort of sense that among liberal secular Israelis, that a liberal, mostly secular agenda is receding. And it's receding because of demographics, and it's receding because of a new unity in the traditional and religious right. And as it recedes, it takes with it some of the strengths and competencies of the state. It's going to be a weaker, less competent, less prosperous country. That fear, I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying that's the fear on the center left that drives a lot of it. That sense of decline is now a big part of the language of protest. So it's not just you screwed up, how could you have done 73 or 82, or it's something larger now, and it's a larger culture war, and the protests are fed by a lot of this, and you see this in the hostage family protests. This political class doesn't want to get the hostages out because then it'll face elections, and it's unpopular, and things like that. So the tenor has gotten, more desperate, more frustrated, more angry. Still, if you go to the protests, even the protests that are really sad and about this really tragic, 279 days in captivity of these Israelis, you see a lot of camaraderie. You see a lot of shared community. You see a lot of happiness to be together and to be fighting, because sitting at home is much worse. And so protests, they're basic to our culture. And by the way, if Netanyahu falls and the right falls and we have a centrist or center-left coalition take their place, expect right-wing protests and expect them to be just as loud and vociferous and angry and worried and also joyful and festive and all the things all at once.
I think you put your finger on it when you said that it's a way to be active and to be doing something. But the real question is, for me, is how effective are they? Meaning, okay, let's back up to the judicial overhaul protests. And there are some who claim that these massive protests contributed to Hamas being emboldened enough, feeling as though Israel was no longer strong enough to deter them. And let's take the hostage release deal as well. If you look at it through Hamas's perspective, you see these masses out in the street, then the military operation itself is losing some of its efficacy, one could say. What do you think of that?
I would say that it's a right-wing talking point. I don't respect it much. I talked to the protesters at the time. When you think that the debate is about whether the Supreme Court's powers need to be reined in one way or reined in another way, or maybe not reined in, and then hundreds of thousands of Israelis for dozens of weeks come out every week and say you're destroying democracy, does that mean you have to accept their rhetoric as your argument? I don't think so. I think you should debate that rhetoric. I don't think it was the destruction of democracy. I also don't think they were stupid for thinking it and feeling it. And I think the government was telegraphing things like it. And I think that they were using the question of democracy as a vocabulary to talk about the fact that our system, one of the maybe simplest electoral systems in the democratic world that has almost no checks and balances outside of this way overpowerful court, is being taken apart and pieced together by incredibly irresponsible leaders who seek to aggrandize their own power, maybe aren't such great democratic liberals like they pretend. And I don't think that criticism is unfair. In other words, even if we need to rein in the court, because it really is very powerful compared to other democratic courts, this, without trust and without a basic public discourse and to do it so violently and in such a bullying political way, and leaving the rest of the country to just hope you're a Democrat because nothing could stop you once this court is gone. By the way, the left-wing argument against judicial reform was an incredible critique of the left, because the argument was nothing will stop them if the court is weakened. Well, why hasn't the left in 50 years or 70 years done something to institute other checks and balances, right? So there's a larger democratic discourse and question that didn't come up in the protests. But the protests were still critically important. And I think that a lot of reasonable, good people on the right understood that. And that in the end is what stopped judicial reform. Because even if the things being screamed at the protest are not good, rational, serious, thoughtful critiques that you should, change your policy for in any protest. That's not just true of those protests, of all protests. The fact that hundreds of thousands of people would come out, the fact that you catalyzed so much fear, was something that they understood and that penetrated. The protests stopped the judicial reform, this incredibly irresponsible and poorly constructed judicial reform. And if we do get back to judicial reform, which frankly I hope we do in a very broad-based opposition, coalition, unity sort of push, it'll be better for it. So I think that was an example where the right likes to, I don't know what to say about that, led Hamas to do October 7th. Hamas planned October 7th. We know this for a fact, long before the protest. Were the protests the reason for the timing? You mean is Netanyahu's weakness as a prime minister and as a government because he pushed ahead on this incredibly irresponsible culture war that split Israeli society in half? Led our enemies to think we're weak? Maybe. Is that literally only the fault of the protesters? Also, Netanyahu's policy of allowing Qatar to fund Hamas or stabilize Hamas for 13 years or whatever it was, I think since 2015, that did not have anything to do with October. In other words, I don't want to fall into right-wing talking points, and I don't want to fall into left-wing talking points. It wasn't the collapse of democracy. It wasn't the protesters who drove October 7, and therefore Netanyahu is just a misunderstood victim of all of this. It was how Israeli tribes tell the other tribes that they need to be listening. And in that sense, the protests worked. And future protests will probably work in the same way.
I didn't want to start debating the merits of the judicial overhaul and the protests against them, but I'm just wondering if this mode of communication that Israelis are now using, which is basically shout as loud as you can, if it is effective in getting their goals. Because, for example, the hostage release protests, yes, polls are showing that, the majority of the country is for the hostage release deal, that the country wants to pause the war or stop the war in order to get the hostages out. But at the same time, my question about whether it may have undermined the IDF's operation in Gaza, I think is valid, because Hamas is not stupid, and it's seeing that swaths of the country are taking to the streets in order to give Hamas what it wants at the same time. What do you think of that?
I think that's an incredibly important point, and absolutely critical for the government to consider and for the war planners to consider. Apologies to listeners, especially right-wing listeners who get tired of me complaining about the government. I blame the government, and I'll tell you why. 67% of Israelis, according to the last poll, which is within 3-4 points of every poll in the last 3 months, want to have a hostage release, even at the cost of ending the war. They're sick of the war. They don't think the war can be won. When you say to them, well, what about the soldiers? They think, no, of course the soldiers can win the war. They don't mean the soldiers. They don't think the government can win the war. And that drove a collapse in morale. And I have to tell you, in that sense, I don't know, by the way, if the protests made more Israelis want to prioritize a hostage release over victory, or if the protests reflect the shift, which was driven by other factors, or if there's some kind of, cycle there, loop that reinforces itself.
Or nexus.
Right. But what the protesters say, and which as far as we can tell, 67% of Israelis now think, is that the government has failed to use this time, these sacrifices of these soldiers, the astonishing tactical successes on the ground of the IDF, to maximize the chances for hostage release, to maximize a better future for Israel in Gaza, meaning for Gaza. In other words, to de-radicalize and stabilize and have a Gaza we can live next to that doesn't try to murder our children. Those kinds of questions of what happens going forward, of the day after, those are something the public believes the government simply hasn't thought about or dealt with. The marches are about the 67% of Israelis who basically agree with the message of the march, of these protesters, are about feeling that the government's incompetent and not using the war to drive a better future. And why do I blame the government? First of all, I think there are a lot of points where policy could have been much better, and the government was hampered from a better policy by Netanyahu's political problems. And that's such a common thing to hear from Israelis. I don't have to explain it to anybody. But it's more than that. He didn't talk. He didn't communicate. He never stood in front of Israelis and explained seriously, empathetically, what the strategy is, how we're going to do it, where we're going to go, what the future looks like. Right? We're basically on schedule for what Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, said would be the war. There'd be a first stage, a second stage. We're now in the third stage. After Rafah, we're starting the third stage. He even said this will be, a month, and this will be 6 months, and then there'll be 12 months to 2 years or whatever it is. And we're basically on schedule for what he said in November to the public. Netanyahu hasn't said anything serious. He went 2.5 months without giving a single interview, and then gave one very fawning, journalistic interview to Channel 14. He won't speak. If the entire question that the public is asking is, can the government run a war and win a war, and the government refuses to speak to the people, that's the government's fault when morale collapses. So if the protests are causing it, or if the decline in morale driven by the government's own behavior is causing it, and that's feeding the protest, or some combination of the two, ultimately it is a government's responsibility in wartime to sustain public morale and public trust. As we saw in judicial reform, this is a political class, a political culture, and folks, if you are a strong, right, passionate supporter of Netanyahu, who thinks he's a great man, you can share in this criticism and you should feel more betrayed than people who hate him, because his failure on this point to talk to the public for months at a time, to explain what's going on, to explain how he hears protesters. We have protest families that have spoken to us at the Times of Israel, hostage families, who say they've been begging for months to meet Netanyahu and can't. I have friends who their family members were taken hostage. It was easier for the group of volunteers that coalesced around them to help them, including my wife, to get them into a meeting with the Chancellor of Germany than to get them into a meeting with an Israeli minister. And that's the experience of the last 9 months. So when you look at the Israeli protesters, step aside a second from the tactical questions, the demand, if you pressure the government, Hamas's price goes up, all of that kind of questioning of the sort of game theory rationale behind the protests and the war and how it should go. You are seeing an echoing chasm of distrust driven by the government's own behavior. And that's true if you love Netanyahu. That's the complaint you should be taking to him. And so again, protests, you don't necessarily have to believe the screaming rhetoric at a protest to deeply believe and respect the protest itself and what it's trying to do and accomplish and reflects in the public mood.
I would have to agree with you, Haviv. And as a mother, I speak now. I look at some of these parents, and these protests are like a primal scream. And who would not scream in that way when your child is 279 days in the hands of monsters?
Yeah. And who are you going to turn to? Your own government's not there, not present. I had a little kerfuffle online with a minister of diaspora, Shikli.
A minister?
We have a minister of diaspora affairs. Nobody knows why. To fund the billion-shekel needs of families who are displaced in this war, the government is cutting across the board from all ministries, except the ministries that are promised in coalition agreements to keep people happy. So stupid, irrelevant, meaningless ministries like the diaspora ministry, the heritage ministry, nobody even knows what the word means, are not, according to this cut presented to the Knesset last week. There's now some talk about how it's going to change. It hasn't changed yet. Are not being cut, but welfare and health and those are being cut. So the Minister of Diaspora Affairs from a ministry that shouldn't exist in wartime came out in this angry tirade about Ehud Olmert. Former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert is running around the world giving interviews, complaining about Netanyahu. And I don't have a lot of love lost for Ehud Olmert, but shut up. There's tens of thousands of families of displaced you're not meeting. There are budgets, desperate budgets. The coalition budgets have gone up even as cutbacks are required everywhere else because the military budget has doubled this year. And you're not there. You're not in the event. Everybody is suffering and you are off whining as if we're in October 6th and we can afford to be whining about partisan things. And that feeling, I share an emotional feeling. By the way, it really important to say, this is not a partisan moment in the simple sense that in the polls we have of public trust in politicians, Netanyahu is at the bottom and Yoav Gallant of Likud is at the top. And so it's not about whether you're in Likud or not in Likud. So many Likudnikim spoke to me personally. Senior people, activists, hardcore central activists, have talked to journalists all over this country over the last month about how the government was passing a bill extending military service for those who serve, while also trying to push forward a bill extending the exemptions for those who don't serve because of Netanyahu's politics. Well, guess what? Likud voters have one of the highest rates of military service and one of the biggest rates of sacrifice in Gaza as soldiers of this entire 9 months of this war. They feel deeply betrayed. Again, so this is not a partisan question. It really is a political culture question. I think in 1973, the sense that the government was resting on its laurels from 67, after the 67 success, we must be so brilliant that there's no way any enemy could ever surprise us. That sense felt to a lot of the public, especially Moti Ashkenazi was one of the great commanders of the one of the most successful commanders of that Egyptian front in that collapse of the Israeli front line. that felt to them like a kind of decadence that drove folly and failure and death. And what we're seeing now among Israelis, what we're seeing now in the simple fact that when you get these anti-government protests, sometimes the right tries to mount a pro-government protest and utterly fails. It gets 500 people to show up next to 100,000. The right that doesn't want this government to fall, that is afraid that its own agenda and vision and it is embarrassed, whereas everybody else is angry. And so those are the same feeling toward the same government for the same sense of collapse and decadence. So, by the way, I'm not even saying Netanyahu won't win the next election, okay? There are going to be a lot of tribal votes. There's going to be Haredi. The campaign will begin. The left could screw it up. You know, it's not arguing something specific and tactical. I'm just saying that sense of a government that abandons us in our most trying moment is very powerful right now.
Haviv, thank you so much for your insights, as usual.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to What Matters Now, the Times of Israel's weekly podcast. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.